All right, I got this video today for y'all. This is, the most loyal Strawhat members, where they stand, right? I got all 9 of the Strawhat members. You know, Luffy's not in it. Of course, Luffy's loyal to himself, loyal to his cause, and what he needs to do. The person at number 1 shouldn't surprise nobody. And number 2 as well. The bottom 2, 10 and or 9 and 8 shouldn't surprise anybody either. Is what I believe. So if you're surprised, I kind of don't know why. This shit was shown in the anime. You can't, deny these facts really. So the most disloyal is Usopp. So Usopp is a guy. And it's kind of shown too. When he, joined the crew, right? He wanted, he still had the Captain Usopp vibes about him. Now he knew that he was part of his crew and other things, and he was kind of joking around, but still, a part of that was, still true. You should follow me. I'm kind of smarter than Luffy. But they knew that they were never going to follow Usopp. And it ain't like, Usopp was doing it for real, but there's still a part of that he thought was, true. And it's also, that Going Merry, right? The Going Merry was Kaya's gift to Luffy for protecting them. And Usopp was going to get in a rinky-dink boat by himself and start his journey. But then they were like, no, you should come with us. And then he was like, okay, I'll come with y'all. So he comes with them and he does his job as a shipwright, even though it's not his job. He's a sniper, but he had to be the shipwright, and he gladly did it because he had, attached some feelings to that. My girl, money, bought that ship, made that ship, this is Akaya's gift to me, not just Luffy's ship is what Usopp's, how he looked at the ship the whole time, more so than anybody else in the crew. He put a lot into that, and he did put time and effort into it. That's true. But the journey, he kind of lost sight of that. And it's, loyal to the crew. This is what this video is about. So Usopp, at Water 7, he couldn't just put that behind him. Everybody else didn't want to lose to Mary either. But Usopp, like I said, he put too much time and effort into the thing. And the thing that, he did do that, but he is a part of the crew, that's what he's there for. He ain't there for taking care of a ship. This ain't take care of the Going Merry. This is, we're finding the One Piece. It's sad that this shit has to go and other things, but, we have to, move on to better things. And everybody was saying that shit, and Usopp was like, you guys are crazy, and Luffy's just like, no, you can't do that. The journey is the journey, and we have to be on that. If you can't do that, then, you're going to be kicked off. They fought each other, and then, Usopp, got his ass kicked. And then, he was still trying to fix the Mary. Professionals said that shit wouldn't work. Even Franky was like, man, I can't, do anything, man. This ship is, almost done. It's like got one more voyage to the next spot, and after that, it's done. And I'm somebody who's been doing ships for years, is what, Franky said. It took something like that for Usopp to kind of open his eyes and then be like, I remember the crew and other things, and, but the loyalty wasn't there. If it was, then he would just be okay with the ship being gone. And then, like I said, I also brought up the fact that he likes to be Captain Usopp, for himself. That's still there, even though he jokes about it, there's still a piece of him that's like, man, if I could, I own people and shit, Usopp's there. Sanji's next, though, I got Usopp out of the way. Now Sanji is too. Sanji was, thinking about the crew. He was. However, he, forgot some things about his fucking captain. He did do that. He actually did forget some things about his fucking captain. Sanji's like, okay, well, the Big Mom pirates are pretty powerful. I can keep Big Mom off of Luffy's dick if I just go with her, do what she wants, marry this girl and everything else. They can live on without me. But that's the thing. They can't live on without Sanji because he's the cook. They don't cook. These other people on the crew don't cook. And even if they do, it's not Sanji's food. So Luffy's like, I need that shit to fuel myself. I eat a lot of food and other things. You can't just fucking leave me out here. You'll leave your fucking captain starved to death. That is foolish. We ain't gonna, and you're basically saying that I can't defeat Big Mom, which I actually can. You're playing games with me and shit. You gotta come back to the crew. Then Sanji, saying that, Luffy's crazy, he can't do that, you shouldn't do that, Luffy, kind of like Luffy, I care about you, but not really. He's basically saying that Luffy can't stand 10 toes against Big Mom, and he's like, no, man, I can fucking do that. I'll stand here and take your fucking punishment, and he did. And Nami was even like, how dare you, Sanji, you attacked our captain and other things. Sanji, he did come to his senses and stuff, but, he was disloyal. He, left the crew. He was like ready to leave the crew. He didn't think, it was basically he had doubts about his captain, and you don't have doubts when you have loyalty. Loyalty, nah, you stick around anyway. That is an enemy that's fucking powerful, and might have my captain beat, but I stick around still. He didn't do that. Luffy had to go save him and do other things. Now, number 7 is Nami. Nami is at number 7, and this is mostly based off of pre-time skip, things. So, in the pre-time skip, she stole the ship and went to Arlong Park. That ship's not hers, for one. That's the ship that's needed to get to the Grand Line and start the journey. That girl was playing games. She took the ship, and then she also thought that Luffy wasn't powerful enough to take down Arlong. Playing games too much. She was trying to take on all her shit herself. But knowing that, the people she was with and everything else, were powerful guys. And she even relied on them then. Why wouldn't she do that now? Luffy's like, kind of like, what the fuck, girl? You don't, believe in my power and shit, He was kind of pissed a little bit, but he was still there for her, and he, handled that business. But the thing is, Nami, left him thinking that he wouldn't understand, thinking that he wouldn't. And Luffy's not that type of person. You're a part of my crew. Goddamn, girl. We'll hold down together. Let me know some things instead of trying to handle that shit yourself. That's why she's at number 7. But also, and there's some non-canon stuff, or I don't know, Strong World. In that movie, not Robin, but Nami went with Golden Lion Shiki. He, scared her, and she's like, Luffy's not powerful enough to fight against the Golden Lion. I might as well go with this guy. And it's to save the crew and other things, but, Luffy, got pissed and he held down against that guy, but again, she didn't trust that Luffy could do that. Her, loyalty was wavering and shit. That's why she's at number 7. Now, the other girl's at number 6. But I'll say this about Nami. After the time skip and shit, she was, basically one of the loyal ones. But just because, she has the history and shit. I'm looking at the history of these people now, y'all. And the whole duration, the whole time she was with the crew, whole time these people were with the crew, how disloyal were they? And she's at number 7. I got Robin at number 6. Robin, was getting hunted down by the world government. She wouldn't tell anybody anything about it. She, at that point, she was like the oldest member of the crew, so she felt the need to, be like, these people, these younger people who are on a journey to do stuff, she was trying to disassociate with the crew and be like, my problems are my problems from my past. I don't want to get these people hurt or in trouble or anything. I'm just I'm just trash. And then, Luffy's like, no, you're not. You are a part of my crew. I know there's something wrong with you. You're playing games. This is not what you do. You're trying to leave and go get executed, basically you want to extinguish your life. That ain't right. My crew member don't do that. I need you because you're smart. I ain't the brightest guy. Girl, you're crazy. You gotta tell me you want to live, bitch. You can't be doing shit like that. And eventually she did, and she got on board, but it took a while. She, like the people below her, thought Luffy couldn't do shit. Thought Luffy, they had doubts about their captain making it, or defeating the enemy. And not only that, but couldn't, thinking that themselves weren't good enough to be in the crew, when Luffy only picks people who are fucking needed by him. You're on the crew for a reason, and it's like actually apparent too. You kind of forgot your fucking position, and that was for some time, but after that, but like I said, we looking at the whole time they're with the crew, and I got her at number 6. Now I got Brook at number 5. Now Brook, you might be like, why at number 5? But he don't, for one, he don't go the extra mile like the other people do for Luffy, and he's not as disloyal as the people below him, but he does have a means to be disloyal if he wanted to. Let me tell you how. Because he, during the time skip, he became a musician. He became a guy who, sings music. He became known as Soul King Brook. Everybody knew about his music. He was going to concerts. He had, concerts in his name and shit. I have to, go here and perform music here and all this other stuff. He had, the spotlight on him, kind of, in a way that was cool, as a musician. And that's what Brook always was. Even before he was a Strawhat, he was a musician for another pirate crew too. That exists in his heart. People can't, and somebody like me can read into this, other fans can't. But I'm like, that could be a means of him, being disloyal. Now, I ain't saying that he's going to do that, but it's a door that could open up. It's possible. The possibility's there, for him to be disloyal. He has that, and people, it's seen in the anime, he's doing that, and then he's like, oh, wait, I have to meet Luffy at, but he's in the spotlight, and he's like, oh, man, I'm, doing this concert, I'm singing for these people. He almost got lost in his own fucking, whatever, forgetting that, oh, fuck, I'm the musician for the Straw Hat Pirates. I got him at number 5, y'all. Yeah. Number 4 is Franky. Now, Franky, his disloyalty, I don't see any, like, kind of ways for him to be disloyal. He kind of can't be, because he created the ship. The ship runs with him, he's the shipwright. He's the actual shipwright who gets, things going. If the, Sunny is, damaged or anything, I fix it. I know the ins and outs. I know about all the gadgets that it has on it and all that. The journey can't happen without Franky, essentially, is what I'm saying here. But here, he don't go the extra mile for him. A truly loyal person will go the extra mile. See, he won't. He will, but it's almost as if, damn, I don't know. He's not effective enough. His impact in doing that wouldn't be enough, and he doesn't do it all the time. He ain't gonna consistently do that. Like, he's there for his position. Like, I'm the shipwright. I'm doing that job, right? But he's not gonna go the extra mile. He would if he could. If something was happening right in front of him, and nobody else could do it, like nobody else could, or he felt like nobody else could, he would try to, he would take a hit for Luffy. He would, do that. He would try to, do that. But he wouldn't do that all the time. He kind of knows that the job is there, but the job, and then like you're a crew member too. Like what I'm saying here is, you're a shipwright, but then you're also the crew member. You have to fight too. This is not, we're pirates and shit. People are after our dicks. And he does fight, y'all, but when it comes, and I'm talking about for Luffy, that's the captain. It wouldn't be the Strawhat Pirates without Luffy, y'all. You gotta remember that shit, y'all. It don't matter if this is your favorite character or not. It's his loyalty to their captain, and that's why I got him at number 4. I got Chopper at number 3. This is an animal, y'all. See, animals, let me say this. Animals attach themselves to people who, care for them, want them around, and other things. Luffy wanted Chopper. He saw Chopper and he's like, that's an animal. I want that guy on my crew. This guy is, interesting, funny, and Chopper is the doctor, right? And his goal is to, treat, or find a cure to treat everybody he can. If anybody's hurt, he's going to try to help them out. He's a doctor like that. He will treat wounds if he has to. Diseases and all kind of shit. And this is, kind of me, my, thinking about that, right? Knowing that shit about Chopper and other things. And Chopper, he won't, go the extra mile necessarily, but I think he would. If the, circumstance or situation dictates it. What I'm saying here is, say Luffy is like right there, he's all fucked up. He's like, I'm fucked up, and Chopper's like the doctor. He's gonna panic a little bit, but he's gonna make sure Luffy's all right. Even if Chopper's a little bit fucked up, he's gonna be like, Luffy, I'm, here for you. I can, get you this treatment real quick. And Luffy's gonna be like, okay, but not really. He ain't gonna do that. He's gonna be like, damn, Chopper, why are you gonna do that? You're fucked up too. And Chopper's like, nope, I'm a doctor and I have to, hold down for my captain and shit, because that's my guy and shit. Take this medicine first, and then I'll make a dosage for myself afterwards. What I'm saying here is he's gonna give the dosage to the captain because the captain needs to live, because that's loyalty. He's loyal to the group and loyal to the cause, and he'll put his body on the line, for Luffy in that way. As far as, I could heal myself first, but I'm going to heal my captain first. I want him to be cool first, and then I'll take care of myself. Because he trusted in his abilities as a doctor, and he also trusts his captain. So he's going to do that shit for him first, and then he'll catch his recoup later. I said, cool, y'all. You got to know that about Chopper, and then the animal thing, that's why he's, loyal. And one of the most loyal, too. But with the animal thing, he's imprinted on a lot of people, too. So, like, that's why he's not a 1 or 2. And he also don't go the extra mile. Like Jinbei, before he was even a crew member, he was like, this boy is Ace's brother. He's trying to find, his brother and save his brother. I'll make sure that he's cool and other things. When Ace died, Luffy was dead. He was in shock. Jinbei was like, I ain't gonna let him die. This boy, this nigga is gonna become the king of the pirates. I ain't gonna let him die. He, took him and he blocked Akahinu's fist barehanded as a fishman. He was getting cooked, y'all. Fish and hot, anything. Come on now, y'all. He was getting cooked. He put his body on the line for Luffy. And then not only that, he was there for Luffy too, to get him back on course with what he was doing. He was like, come on, Luffy, you can't be down like this. You ain't supposed to do this. Aren't you gonna find your crew? You might have lost your brother, but you still have people out there that are waiting for you to come back into their lives and recruit them back. Your crew's out there waiting for you and shit. You can't forget about that. You're going after the One Piece too. Everybody put their life on the line for you to, do that shit, and go after your goals and shit. And he was like, he was reminded that because of Jinbei. And then Jinbei met him at Fishman Island. Jinbei gave him his blood. After he fought against 40 Jones and he lost a lot of blood, he had some blood loss. He was like, I'll give him some of my blood. And he wasn't bitching about it. And, other people were bitching about it because it's Fishman and people. But he was like, no, here, I'll give him my blood. He wasn't bitching about it. He was like, no. That's, my future captain and stuff. He had to go to Big Mom and tell her other things. He told Big Mom, he went up to her in person and said, I'm not riding with you anymore, bitch. I'm riding with the Strawhat Pirates. It's cool. You've done this for me and other stuff, but I'm riding for Strawhat Pirates now. We're done now. And he wasn't scared and other stuff. He didn't get his soul snatched and none of that shit. And he got out of there. And then he saved Luffy from the book. And then, Luffy, he was respectful too. He was like, I can't go with you right now, Captain, because I have to, finish some loose ends. I have to make sure my crew that I was the captain of, make sure those people are safe. Then I can come back to you. And then Luffy was like, you come back to Wano and you make sure you're there. And he was there. Jinbei showed up like he was supposed to. And, he held down there. He broke who's hands and he gave him the fucking beat down that he was supposed to. And then he was a member of the crew. He now has a bounty of 1 point something billion, because he's with Luffy and he's rocking with Luffy. There's only one person who's more loyal than him, and that's the day one nigga and shit. That's Zoro. Zoro was tied to a post in some fucking place, right? And where Captain Morgan was, and he was like, I'm a swordsman, I did what I did to somebody, I'm probably gonna die here. Or not die here. I only have to be out here for 3 days and they'll let me go. But they were gonna kill him and shit. So, Luffy was like, I'll get you swords and, now you can, be a member of my crew. And he's like, I guess I have nothing better to do. See, it was either that or go back to being a pirate hunter. And hunting other pirates and other things. But he saw what Luffy can do, and he was like, all right, this guy seems all right. I can, roll with him, and I'll just do it. And I can become the greatest swordsman in the world, like doing that, There's people who need cut down and people who use swords along the way. So I'll just, fight them as I need to, train along the way, but I'm the vice captain of this guy's crew. He started to realize that once he was like, Luffy was like, well, you're my first guy and shit. And he was like, oh, wait, what? And then he was just like, okay, well, at least there's booze and other things. I'll follow this guy. Zoro's not the smartest guy, but he knew this about Luffy. He knew this. He knew that Luffy was going to, stick to what he was going to do and that he was going to stick to what he was going to do. And that he knew that both of them had goals. And these goals were not, these dreams were not easy to attain, but he saw that in Luffy, Pirate King, that's something that's not easy. I want to be the greatest swordsman in the world. He's like, we were meant to be friends and shit. We have to, link up and do this shit. And they stayed, loyal. And then this is where he proved his loyalty. It was during Thriller Bark. Like I say, I don't like that arc. But Zoro had, a good showing there. Kuma showed up and, the crew was all knocked out. He was still standing up. Kuma was trying to go for Luffy's body and then, Zoro got there. Zoro was, trying to stand on business, but he was tired from the fights he was in with Ryuma and then and Moria. But then Bartholomew Kuma was like, okay, well, if you want to be so loyal to your captain, you have to take your captain's pain and all that, all the shit that he endured with Moria and, Oris, all the pain he felt, and suffered through. And just a taste of that was able to put Zoro on his ass. But then he got up and he took on the whole big ass. There was a whole big ass bubble, y'all, a red bubble that had pain of all sorts, inside of it, and in the morning, when they woke up, Sanji was like, where's Zoro at? And then he saw blood everywhere and Zoro was just standing there. And then he was like, what happened to you? And he was like, nothing. And Zoro was there like that. And Zoro ain't the best at direction. So then when Kuma came later, he got shot to another island. But even when he got shot to another island, he was like, I got to get back to my captain. I got to get back to, my captain, He had that in his mind. And then he was also the first one to get to Sabaody. Even with the bad sex and direction, he was still the first one to get there. You know, if anybody had a loyal vice captain, it was Luffy, and that guy is the most loyal crew member. You can't tell me otherwise. You kind of are cracked out if you think otherwise. That's a day one nigga and shit. That's episode, like, one of the first episodes, and he's been in, all that with Luffy. He's been in the show as much as Luffy has. A little bit less because he's not the main character, but, they were there for each other. Wano, he saw Zoro and he was like, hey, Zoro. And then Zoro was like, yeah. And then they were fighting together and everything. He came up to the rooftop with his captain, to fight against Kaido. And he scarred Kaido, did a little bit, gave him a little bit of help. And that's, the most loyal, members of the Strawhat Pirates, and that's ranked. Usopp's the least loyal, then it's Sanji, then it's, Nami, Robin, Brooke, Franky, Chopper, Jinbei, and then the most loyal is Zoro. But yeah, stay cool on the corner and let me know if you agree, disagree, and then in the comments, you could even put your list down if you know about this. But stay cool on the corner.